Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss communicable disease epidemiology. And this session, we're going to familiarize ourselves with what communicable diseases are and how we can distinguish them from non-communicable diseases. We shall also look at how these diseases are transmitted and what ways can be put in place such that we can prevent the transmission of these diseases. Okay, we shall look at what we call the epidemiological model, and we shall at epidemiological triad, and we shall use this to be able to understand how we can control the transmission of infectious diseases. We shall look at concepts to do with the interaction of infectious diseases or infectious agents with the immune system. Okay, and we'll see how the infectious agent causes an infection in an individual and how that progresses from one stage to the other, either from infection to either recovery or from infection to death. Okay. So communicable diseases are some of the diseases that are of public health importance, especially in developing countries. These diseases are caused by infectious agents, which can be viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and others. Okay, these diseases are transmitted from one person to the other. Okay, it can be through direct contact or through indirect means of transmission. That means that biologically, if the organism cannot, that is, if the infectious agent cannot get a host, then it means that it is not biologically successful. The success or the survival of an organism depends on its ability to get a host and be able to reproduce such that it can actually survive. Okay, so we'll look at different microbes and the different ways in which they adapt to be able to get hosts and even survive in this host, reproduce, and even evolve. Okay, and that is especially covered in microbiology. So these infectious diseases can occur rapidly. That is, the onset can be rapid in a short duration, and then the manifestation of these infectious diseases, can be seen in an individual. So these ones that have very quick manifestation and onset, we call them acute diseases or acute communicable diseases or acute infectious diseases. And then those that take long to manifest, okay, but still they can also still have acute phases in them. They're the ones we call chronic diseases or chronic infectious diseases. There is always the use of the word chronic diseases to refer to non-communicable diseases. Okay, and that is true that communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases are usually diseases that span a long period of time. So calling them chronic is actually okay, but that does not mean that all chronic conditions are non-communicable diseases. Diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, these are infectious diseases, but they have they are chronic in nature. Okay, so they are long-lasting. They have they span over a long duration of time, years. Okay. So in developing countries, we talk about double burden of disease because communicable diseases are very, very common, but at the same time, you have an increase in the non-communicable diseases. This therefore means that we are dealing with two problems at a go, and that's what we term as the double burden of disease. Okay, the non-communicable diseases, we often refer to them as silent killers because they do not come out full blown when a person has one of them. Okay, so for example, a person can have hypertension, but they're not aware that they have hypertension for some very good time until the late stages. It's the same thing with cancers. They can still have that kind of manifestation. Okay, so currently in developing countries, we are having an increase in non-communicable diseases because of different factors. Urbanization, the lifestyle changes, and economic changes, all these influence what people eat and their lifestyle. So the occurrence of non-communicable diseases is on an increase. And for certain countries that, for example, had prolonged periods of war, the communicable diseases still continue to be a major problem. Okay, so for example, in South Sudan, most of the cases that we receive in our health facilities, regardless of whether it is a primary healthcare center, primary healthcare unit, or hospitals, majority of them are often communicable diseases. Malaria, pneumonia, infectious diarrhea, and other diseases that primarily are causing infant death or child death or under 5 mortality rates. These are conditions that are primarily or majorly infectious disease. And if you check in any facility around, you will find out that more than 7 out of the 10 visits are because of infectious diseases. So to be able to control these infectious diseases, we need to be able to know how they are spread from one person to the other. I'm going to be sweating a little bit. So when we talk about transmission of these infectious diseases, we are talking about how the infectious agents spread from one person to the other, or from the reservoir to a susceptible host. Okay, so we describe the whole chain of events from moving from a host or a reservoir. I mean, moving from a reservoir to the host as what we call the chain of infection. And I will go through the chain of infection one by one. We have 6 elements, and it is very important to understand the linkages, such that if you are to implement control measures, you basically break the linkage from one component to the other. So the infectious agent is an organism that can cause an infectious disease, and we have said that these can be viruses, bacteria, protozoa, and others. Okay, so these have to live in a reservoir. Okay, the reservoir can be animals, they can be humans, it can be the environment. This is to say, where the organism stays is what we call the reservoir. Okay, and then it is very important to note that in humans, or even in animals, you have what we call carriers. Okay, and an individual who has an infectious agent and can transmit it, but they themselves are not having the manifestation of the disease caused by this infectious agent. So they are not showing any signs and symptoms. So they can be asymptomatic. Okay, they can be asymptomatic, yet they are carriers of this infectious disease. And then we have incubatory carriers. These people or these individuals are infectious before the symptoms appear. Okay, and this is very important for prevention measures. It doesn't not necessarily mean that A person who has the symptoms is the one who is infectious. That means that they are the ones that can transmit the infection, not necessarily all the time. So we have diseases that are infectious when the signs and symptoms have manifested, but we also have those that are not that cannot transmit the infection until a later stage when the signs manifest, the signs and symptoms manifest. And then we have those that are recovering from an infection, but they are still carriers. Okay, convalescent carriers. These are people who can transmit the infectious agent, yet they are actually in the process of recovering. So, for example, Ebola cases. Okay, with Ebola cases, someone is recovering. They need to have a particular duration for which they don't engage in sexual activity because they can still transmit the Ebola virus. And then we have the chronic carriers. These are individuals who carry the infectious agent over a long period of time. That means that they continue to have the infectious agent for a considerable period of time. So we move to component number 3, which is port of exit. If the infectious agent is within the reservoir, it has to get out. Okay, it has to get out of the body of the reservoir, and it can be through secretions, it can be through sneezing, and be through feces. Okay, these are ways in which the organisms get out of the reservoir. And then the transmission from one person to the other happens through either direct means of transmission or the indirect means of transmission. So the direct ones can include kissing, can include touching, can include sexual contact, or coming into contact with the mixing of blood and body fluids. And then we have indirect means of transmission of infections, where the agent travels through an intermediate route. Okay, this is where we talk about airborne diseases, foodborne diseases. That means that there is an innominate object through which the agent can get into contact with its susceptible host. Okay, it can be sharing the same towels, sharing the same sharp objects and things like that. Okay, and this is where we can also talk about blood-borne infections. Okay, for example, drug abusers, okay, who use injections. If they share the injections, then it is likely that you will have them getting what you call blood-borne infections. Okay, hepatitis, HIV, and others. And then port of entry. That means that when the agent has now exited the reservoir, it has to enter into a susceptible host to get to cause an infection. Okay, so the susceptible host can inhale the infectious agent. They can ingest food that contains infectious material, or it can be through the urinary system for UTIs, and then also through the broken skin, and many other different ways through which infections or infectious agents can get entry into the susceptible host is the body. And then the last component is the susceptible host. Now the person has perhaps whether it is inhaled, but whatever means that they have this infectious agent. This infectious agent now establishes itself and starts to cause injury that manifests as an infection. Okay, so if the person is immunocompetent, it is likely that they will fight off this infection, and then they're actually okay. But if, for example, they are immunocompromised, maybe they're elderly, maybe they're having a chronic condition, or they are taking immunosuppressant drugs, or whether they are having a chronic condition that is actually compromising their immunity. HIV, for example, this disrupts the immunofunction. Okay, so when a person gets an infection, if the person is actually normal, they would have fought off this infection. But if they are immunocompromised, and for example, if they have HIV, stroke AIDS, then they get this infection. Okay, that could have otherwise been fought off. Okay, so that actually makes the person susceptible to recurrent infections, what we also call as opportunistic infections. So not everybody that gets into contact with infectious agents that they will actually have the manifestation of the infection. Okay, so that means that getting a particular infection carries a probability. There is a probability in there. So the transmission probability is about the likelihood that an infectious host will transmit an agent to a susceptible host during contact. Whether that contact is direct or indirect, the chances that the chances that the person or the susceptible host can get an infection depend on different factors. It could be individual factors, okay? The factors that I've talked about, the level of immunocompromisation, which is affected by diseases, by the drugs that they're taking, that the nutritional status, but also other individual factors play an important role, genetic makeup, lifestyle, and others. They play an important role, but also the nature of the infectious agent. Okay, the nature of the infectious agent. We have infectious agents have different ways in which they can cause an infection. Pathogenicity. Different pathogenic organs or agents have different mechanisms in which they cause infections. So we have those that have to be in a larger dose, infectious dose, for them to be able to cause an infection. And then we have those that they require only a few of these microbes or these infectious agents for them to cause the disease. So the nature of the infectious diseases, of the infectious agent, plays an important role on whether the person can contract the disease or not. Okay, and we have talked about issues to do with immunocompromisation, which is affected. Immunocompetence is affected by age, affected by the drug someone is taking, is also affected by the conditions that they could be having. The type of contact that the infectious agent comes, how it gets into contact with the susceptible host. Contact with, for example, infectious agents that are in blood through maybe a simple prick. The chances of getting an infection by a simple prick are not comparable to the chances of getting an infection if we had a blood transfusion with blood that is not actually screened properly. Okay, the chances, of course, for blood transfusion, the chances are very high, but for chances of a transmission because of a needle prick, for example, accidental needle prick, the chances are minimal. Okay, but if you also have repeated needle pricks, okay, for example, the the drug abusers that use injections. If these injections are repeated, then the chances, of course, will increase than if perhaps it was a one-time thing. This reminds us of what happened with COVID-19, where the elderly and those that had chronic conditions actually had the cases were high, okay, but also their chances of recovery was very low compared to young individuals, and even the extent to which the infection is severe, okay. For the elderly and those that had other comorbidities, they, they those who recovered had severe severe experiences, okay, compared to those that were immunocompetent and also perhaps young. Okay, so those are the factors that can determine the chances that an infection can arise in a susceptible host who has had contact with an infectious agent. So we use what we call the epidemiological triad to be able to understand how infections spread. So the epidemiological triad has the host, which we are terming as the susceptible host, the agent, and then the environment. Some diseases, some infectious diseases actually require a vector, okay, and that's why we have a vector in there. Okay, malaria, for example, the vector is the female Anopheles mosquito. Okay, so this still also is related to the chain of infection. We can still use this to be able to know what to do at a given level. So with the host, issues to do with making sure that they don't get into contact with the infectious agent. If we are going to take malaria, for example, sleeping under the mosquito net using mosquito repellents, also taking chemoprophylaxis. These are different ways that we can prevent malaria, but based on the host. When it comes to the environment, we need to make sure that we don't have bushes, we don't have stagnant water, and there are no dark corners and things like that. There are no bleeding areas. And then also issues to do with the agent. We can spray mosquitoes. We can also introduce mosquitoes that are mutants. This is something that is being tested. Introducing mutant mosquitoes that cannot actually carry the Plasmodium species that causes malaria. Okay, and things like that. And again, back to the host. Recently, there was an approval for the use of the malaria vaccine, and some countries are rolling that out. And perhaps it will become one of the mainstream ways or mainstream ways of combating malaria, for example. So these causal concepts can be used in helping us to visualize how we can implement interventions to tackle a particular infectious disease. When we talk about the natural history of disease, we are referring to the events that can really happen when an individual is exposed to a particular infectious agent. Okay, so the stages are that the first one is, of course, exposure to the first infectious disease. And so that means that the infectious disease has gained entry into the susceptible host, and that it is getting used and starting to multiply. Okay, it enters the susceptible host body and then moves to where they can cause injury, and also start to multiply. So during that time, the signs and symptoms of the infection are not apparent. So we have the latent period. Okay, that transition where the person has been infected, but they are not actually infectious. Okay, still that time also can include what we are calling the incubation period, which is still also from the infection to when you have the person becoming sick or showing signs and symptoms of the disease. So that means that the latent period is still with the incubation period still covers the latent period, and then it extends further. Okay, so it's like you have the infectious disease, the infectious agent entering into your body, and you cannot transmit it to others. That is the latent period. And then the period that we call the incubation period is when the infection has entered, infectious agent, you get the infection, and then it extends up to the time when you start to show signs and symptoms. And then, of course, the next stage there is what we call the symptomatic period, where the signs are now, the symptoms are very apparent. And then the recovery, which we can call the convalescent, happens. That is, if it does not result into death. But you also have instances where someone can recover from a disease, but they still have disabilities associated with the disease. Okay, so it could be an issue to do with either weakening, body weakness, or paralysis of some body parts, yet the infection has actually cleared. So that is an issue to do with disability. Okay, so let's look into the incubation period further and basically understand it better. We are saying that the period from infection up to when the symptoms emerge, that is what we call the incubation period. Different diseases have different incubation periods, and in this diagram we can see that rabies has a longer duration, incubation period. Okay, so the incubation period may not really be the same for different organisms, but also still, if you have different individuals being infected by the same infectious agent, they will not have the symptoms appearing at the same time. So what are these factors that influence this? This is when we talk about issues to do with organism replication. Okay, the time that is needed for the organism to multiply to sufficient numbers for the disease to happen. Okay, this of course varies between one organism, between organisms. Okay, and then okay. Okay, so the second factor is what we are calling the site of replication. Okay, different infectious agents will target different organs of the body, and that is where they will actually multiply. Okay, If the infectious agent gets into the organs that they are actually targeting, then the multiplication could be faster, and that means that you have the infection progressing at a faster rate. Okay, and then we have the infectious dose, how the amount of infectious agent that a person is exposed to. If you have a low dose, most likely you not have an infection, or if the infection will happen, it will take some considerable time. But if the dose is higher, then it is likely that the incubation period is going to be shorter. Okay, so the knowledge of of the incubation period is very important for us in public health, because it allows us to know if we are to quarantine individuals. We can quarantine them for a given period of time. Okay, so it gives us that that understanding, and this has historical context to it. Okay, and when there was the Black Death pandemic, the Venetian Republic implemented measures to inspect incoming ships for sick passengers, and if someone is actually sick, then, or if someone has gotten into contact with a sick person, they are actually isolated for some time, 40 days, before they can actually be allowed to proceed. And that is where the origin of the word quarantine comes from. And it's actually coming from an Italian phrase, okay, which means 40 days. Quaranta goroni, which means 40 days. So that is the historical perspective to where we quarantine emerged from, and we continue to use that even up to today. Okay. So what happens when someone is exposed to an infectious agent? Someone can get the disease, other people will not get the disease, others will get mild symptoms, others will get severe symptoms. So there are different individuals will react, or different individuals will react differently to being exposed to an infectious agent. Okay, sometimes you can have someone who has been exposed to infectious agents, but you will never know that they have actually been exposed, because if you do biochemical tests, microbial tests, and other tests, you may not have any evidence that actually you will not have any evidence that actually got the infection. Okay, this happens when you have a low dose and the person is immunocompetent. Okay, so you will not have an increase in, let us say, white blood cells, or no antibodies will be produced and things like that. And then you have those that an infection will cause an inflammation to occur, and this inflammation takes care of this micro agent. It contains it. Okay, so you have simple signs of inflammation that contain the microorganism. Maybe in an inadili sahihi. And then we also have individuals. Okay. And then you have individuals who will have the illness manifesting, but for a short time, and it is cleared by the immune system. And then we have individuals who will have the full-blown infection progressing for a considerable period of time and may cause irreversible damage or even death. So this is still to emphasize that different individuals will have different manifestation of an infectious disease. So the severity of the disease will depend on how much they have inhaled, the extent to which the infectious agent is virulent, the site of infection, and then the host characteristics, issues to do with the immunocompetence, which we have really explained at greater length. So for us to know whether the disease is actually very serious or not, we use the indicator, case fatality rate. Case fatality rate gives us the indication of how severe the disease is. It tells us the proportion of people who die from a particular disease. Okay? Among all diagnosed cases within a period. So if you have 10 people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19, how many of those will die? So you convert that into a percentage. So you have, if you have 2 people dying, you have two out of 10 times 100 to give you the case fatality rate. Okay, if 10 people have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and then out of these 10, 2 die because of the COVID-19, the case fatality rate is calculated by the number of people who die divided by the total number of people who have been diagnosed with the disease times 100. Okay, so here you will have 20%. Okay, you have 20% as the case fatality rate. So this tells us the extent to which the disease is severe. Okay, and this is where you now you institute different public health mechanisms to make sure that the disease cannot be spreading from one person to the other. Okay, so for example, Ebola has a high fatality rate compared to actually COVID-19. We have the concept of the iceberg of disease, or the iceberg phenomenon of disease. It is very common in public health that we actually should be knowing this. What does this really refer to? In a water body, you can have an ice which is visible out above the water, but you can't see what is below the water. Okay, so for you, you may see something that is very small here, yet below there is something very big here. Okay, it's the same thing that happens in our health system, that the people who come to the health facility and we record them, diagnose them, and treat them are fewer compared to those that have not really come. Okay, we have those that have the disease and they don't know that they have the disease. We have those that are feeling unwell and they have decided not to come. And then we have those who get the disease and then they decide not to come but still die even without coming to the health facility. So you never see them. So that is what we call the iceberg phenomena of disease in public health. So for cases that you see, whether it is HIV, whether it is tuberculosis, whether it is cancers, whether it is what, always think about the fact that you can have a lot of these cases in the communities unattended to. Okay, so down you have a very big problem, and then the few that you see are are the ones who come to the hospital, diagnose them, and give them treatment. So this also applies to, it applies, of course, whether communicable or even non-communicable diseases. So someone, when they feel unwell, they can come. And then we have those that may not be feeling unwell, yet they have the disease and they will never really come. So it is an issue to do with clinical manifestation of an illness, and then those that are not having the full-blown clinical manifestation to make them to come to the hospital. But still, it is very important for you to know that you have individuals in the communities that are not having these signs and symptoms, but if it is an infectious disease, they're actually transmitting the disease. And you need to be aware of that. Okay? So the disease has signs and symptoms, they come. That's what you see. Those that don't have signs and symptoms, they don't come, so you don't see them. And they are the majority. Okay? So the risk factors that you saw here within the population, it's just a matter of time that these risk factors will progress to cause a disease and then manifesting, and then you have it moving to the top in that direction. So the conditions can be non-clinical. Many conditions can be non-clinical in different states. We have those that we can call preclinical disease. Okay, the progression to clinical disease will happen, but it is not yet time for it to manifest. So the person could be having stage 1 cancer, and they are okay. They are living normally, unless they go for a medical checkup. If the health system may not detect, you will not detect that this person has stage 1 cancer. Okay, so that does not mean that the cancer will disappear. It will definitely move to stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4. Okay, so that is preclinical. And then subclinical, no symptoms, and you won't progress to clinical disease. Okay, so this is actually where you can have some of the carriers. Some of the carriers fall into this category. They will continue to shed the infectious agent into the population, but they will never have the disease manifesting clinically. Do we need to worry about them? Definitely we should be, because they are transmitting the infectious agent. And then we have persistent chronic disease. Okay, infection that persists for years, that after perhaps a change in immunocompetence, they can develop the infection later on. Okay, so TB can fall into this category. If you're exposed to Mycobacterium tuberculosis, you may not get the TB immediately, and you stay for a considerable duration of time until perhaps when you get immunocompromised. Okay, that's the same thing that can talk about with issues to do with post-polio syndrome that will continue to exist even after experiencing childhood polio. And then latent disease, okay, an infection with inactive agent. Okay, so still the infection is not manifesting, but that does not mean that the infection is not there. It's only that the agent is inactive. Okay, so we have different ways in which these different communicable diseases can really manifest. Okay, we have those that are instant, we have those that take time, and then we have those that will continue to exist within an organism for a long period of time, and when they manifest, they are hugely fatal. So that means that the immunity is very important. at individual level, but also at population level. Okay, and we have explained that the factors that cause immunocompromisation. When we use the word susceptible, we say that these are individuals who are likely to get an infection. Okay, and the person who is immunocompetent, these are individuals that have the ability to fight an infection. Okay, that means they are protected. Okay, their immune system is working normally to to to, to address some of these infectious agents that they may come into contact with. But that doesn't mean that they are completely 100% not going to get any infectious disease. Okay, so that is also very important to note. Herd immunity. Some of these communicable diseases already have vaccines for them. Okay, and if we immunize a large proportion of the population, then it means that we are protecting also individuals within that population that could not have been immunized. Okay, if I may repeat that, we're saying that if you run an immunization campaign and most of the people are now immunized, this is to say that they are now protected against the disease that we have immunized against, then it means that you have reduced the chances that they will get into contact with the person who is infected. And in that way, the whole population is actually protected. And that is what we call herd immunity. The benefits that you will have because the larger population is actually immunized. So when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, some countries relied a lot on herd immunity as one of their strategies to control the spread of the infection. If you have a lot of people immunized, it means that we have reduced the chances that the people who are not immunized will get into contact with those who are infected. So how do we achieve that? The disease must be limited to one host. This is to say that you should not have another host species in between. And then the reservoir, of course, should be humans. You shouldn't be having animal reservoirs because for you, the immunization campaign has been in humans. And then if animals are not, then it means they can be the transmitters. And then if the person gets infected, then they recover from it. That recovery should offer them strong immunity to fight the disease again. Okay, and then the other thing is that the people should be mixing randomly. Okay, those are the conditions that you should have in place for you to basically rely on herd immunity. Earlier on, we talked about what we call the case fatality rate, which tells us about how severe the condition is. But we also can estimate the transmission probability of an infection. What are the chances, or what is the likelihood that an infection can move from one person to the other, or what are the chances that if a person is exposed to infectious agent, they will actually get the disease. So we have two parameters that we can talk about here. The attack rate, which is the measure of how likely someone at risk is to develop a particular disease during a particular time frame. Okay, so the calculation is that attack rate is equal to the number of the new cases divided by the total population. And then you can multiply that by 100. issues. And this is very important in comparing the risk factors across different groups, but also across different exposures. And we can also particularly use it in food-specific attack rates. That is to say that if someone ate food that is contaminated with the infectious agents, what are the chances that they will get the infection? It's very important to look into the time. Okay, if you're talking about infected food, then the manifestation of the food poisoning, if that's what you're talking about, should be within what we expect of how the infectious agent will cause the infection in the human. Okay, so it is very important to note that you will have individuals that we call the primary case, the people who get into contact with the infectious agent and then get the infection. We call them the primary case. We can also use the word index case or patient zero. Okay, then we can use that case as a reference point. So, okay, maybe the infection started from here, but of course you may not really know. Okay, because you can have other people who got exposure but did not have the signs and symptoms. So the primary case, index case, or patient zero, we are using it as a reference, but may not necessarily be that indeed they are the first ones to have been exposed and get the disease. And then the secondary case, we are referring to individuals that get the infection from other contacts. Okay, so you have patient A ate beans and then got ill. And then, so this, we are referring to this as the primary case or the index case or patient zero. And then you have, if this condition is actually contagious, you have another person B who got the case from A. So we call this one the secondary case. So we have attack rate, and then we have secondary attack rate, which we shall look at here. Okay, so A got exposed to the infectious agent and then became ill, and then the patient B got into contact with patient A, and then patient B also became ill. So the number of people that get a disease from primary cases is that tabulation is what we call secondary attack rate. Okay, so it helps us to also know the extent to which the disease is transmitted from person to person. Okay, so secondary attack rate is about person to person. So let's look at an example here. At a school, lunch was served, and that lunch had chicken. And then out of those that ate that chicken, the 200 students that ate chicken, 30 became ill with the foodborne illness. Okay, 30 became ill of the foodborne illness. Determine the attack rate. Okay, the attack rate is about people who got illness after being exposed to the infectious agent. Okay, so you have the 30 people who got sick divided by out of the 200 that ate. So you have an attack rate of 15%. Okay, so 15% of the students who ate the chicken became ill. Okay, we can determine the attack rate, the secondary attack rate, if we we look at how many of the family members of those students who got ill the uh, got the foodborne illness. Okay, those that are sick, out of the total, those that got the illness later on, out of all those that got exposed, gives us the secondary attack. So in prevention is usually very important in public health, and we have talked about the different levels at length. Primordial prevention, addressing the underlying causes of disease is very important. Issues to do with addressing social inequalities, issues to do with the reducing poverty levels, smoking, pollution. These are underlying factors that cause diseases to manifest. So if we address them, that is what we call primordial prevention. And then we move to primary prevention, preventing the initial infection, proper nutrition, immunization, chemoprophylaxis. These are all breastfeeding. These are all primary prevention ways. Secondary prevention is concerned about detecting the disease early. Remember the iceberg phenomena, where we have a lot of diseases down, and those that we see are very few. If we detect the diseases early enough, it could be better. That is secondary prevention. Tertiary prevention is about minimizing disability associated with the disease and even death. This is when you have a person, for example, having a disease, but you don't want that person to, you don't want the disease to progress to death, to disability and things like that. So this is where you now give, if it is hypertension, you enroll them for antihypertensive medication for life. Okay, to make sure that the hypertension does not actually kill them fast, to make sure that they continue to work even when they have hypertension. And then quaternary, this is about making sure that you don't really spend resources unnecessarily, especially if you have late disease, okay, late stage disease, terminal illnesses. This is where we now need to focus on palliative care, okay. If you talk about a terminal illness, it means that this is consequently going to result into death, okay. But if you basically know, you may not be very 100% sure, but definitely you have poor prognosis, okay. It is, let us say, stage 4 cancer, and it has attacked all the major organs. Death will definitely happen, okay. Death will definitely happen. So what do? Have a very good palliative care team to take over instead of continuing to pump all these medications, yet you will not have very promising results. So quaternary prevention is about ensuring that, please let us not over-medicate, over-diagnose, because we are dealing with the terminal case. So let's look at the levels of disease occurrence. We can call this the patterns of disease occurrence. What this looks at is how a disease is happening within a particular population. So this relies on public health surveillance. We get to know the number of cases of different diseases in a particular community because of surveillance. And then we come to a conclusion that usually over the last 5 years, this condition is always within these numbers. And then you also detect that, oh, this year, this condition has increased. Oh, this year, this number has gone down, okay? So if we have expected number of cases, we can talk about different terms here. Endemic is when the condition is always low in a particular population. Okay? Low to moderate levels. And you can have malaria in some cases. Okay? In some regions, not South Sudan, for example. And then when we have what you call hyperendemic diseases, these are conditions that are always existing, but this time very high. Very high. Okay? So that is hyperendemic. And then sporadic diseases, these ones appear anyhow in different areas at different times. These are what we call sporadic cases. And then the cases that occur in higher amounts compared to perhaps previous years, we have what we call epidemic. You have the numbers shooting higher. Okay, so this is usually associated with outbreaks in particular areas. And then outbreak is the same as epidemic, this is used especially by public health officials, also authorities. If we have, for example, a measles outbreak in one of the states or counties, this is to say that the cases of that condition have not been there, but now has emerged. Okay, emergence of an infection that has not been happening in a particular population is what you call an outbreak. And then a pandemic is when we're talking about an epidemic, but at a global proportion. Okay, several countries are being affected. The COVID-19 pandemic is the example. But we also, of course, have had other several pandemics before, the latest one being the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, the Black Death pandemic, the American plague, flu pandemic, Spanish flu, Asian flu, these are examples of pandemics, including HIV, stroke, AIDS. So that has been our presentation on communicable disease infection. Communicable disease epidemiology, where we have looked at the natural cause of disease, why are people having catching diseases, infectious diseases, while others cannot. And then we have also looked at the disease patterns of communicable diseases in terms of expected numbers and also excess numbers. Thank you.